What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Wednesday, March 10th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, welcome back to the NBA. I'm going to do an extended welcome back version of these picks here tonight. So we have a 2-game slate. Let's take a look at the point guard position. I like Russell Westbrook from the Washington Wizards playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Russell Westbrook has averaged 46.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 31% usage rate. He scored 65, 54, and 44 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 35, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 46.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's 9,800 FanDuel salary and 300 more on DraftKings. So I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 238 points scored in this game. So this is the high scoring game on the slate. It's a great game to stack. And Russell Westbrook has scored 54 and 63 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Grizzlies. It's a good matchup. So I like Russell Westbrook here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. The other point guard that I like is Ja Morant from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Ja Morant has averaged 36 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He scored 49, 55, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 38, 33, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 36.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.6 times value. He's 8,000 FanDuel salary and 200 less on DraftKings. So Ja Morant has been on fire. I think he can score 40 fantasy points or more here and get you 5 times value or more. And he scored 55, 57, and 36 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Wizards. It's a fantastic matchup, a home game, a fast-paced game. So I like Ja Morant here versus the Washington Wizards. Okay, so in my other video, I gave you a couple of DraftKings picks. I'm going to go over those real quick right now. On DraftKings, I like DeJounte Murray from the San Antonio Spurs, and he's 8,500 FanDuel salary, but he's 1,000 less on DraftKings. So he's only 7,500 DraftKings salary. He's averaging 35.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 33, 41, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 30, and 36 minutes. He's projected at 37.5 fantasy points here tonight. Now, that's only 4.4 times value on FanDuel, but it's right around 5 times value or more on DraftKings. So that's why I like this play as a DraftKings pick. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 221 points scored in this game. So I like DeJounte Murray on DraftKings here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, and the other pick that I had for you was a DraftKings value play. Now, this is definitely a DraftKings play only, high risk, high reward play. I like Tyus Jones from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards. Tyus Jones has averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 22 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 13, 13, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 13, 14, and 16 minutes. He's projected at 17.9 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 3.6 times value because he's 5,000 FanDuel salary, so we're not playing Tyus Jones on FanDuel. But he's 1,900 less on DraftKings. So that 17.9 fantasy points is 5 times value or more on DraftKings. And you can see he's averaging 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season. And we know Vegas thinks this is going to be a super high scoring game here. 238 points scored in this game. Great matchup. So I like Tyus Jones as a high risk, high reward tournament play on DraftKings here versus the Washington Wizards.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won,
and then we'll send you $100 PayPal.
So it's that easy,
and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video.
So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Patty Mills from the San Antonio Spurs playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing shooting guards. Patty Mills has averaged 20.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 21% usage rate. He scored 19, 19, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 26, 21, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 21 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's 4,000 FanDuel salary and 500 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. So Patty Mills has scored 20, 17, 20, 12, and 8 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Dallas Mavericks. 3 out of those 5 games, he would have been hitting or exceeding value on FanDuel. So I think he makes a nice FanDuel value play here. So I like Patty Mills here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Dillon Brooks from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards. Dillon Brooks has averaged 27.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate. He scored 55, 32, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 31, and 21 minutes. He's projected at 27.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.9 times value. He's 5,600 FanDuel salary and 200 less on DraftKings. So he scored 32, 14, 41, and 23 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Wizards. So 3 out of those 4 games were fantastic. He's got an awesome matchup here tonight. We know that the Washington Wizards have the 3rd worst defense overall, but they also give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. So I like Dillon Brooks here versus the Washington Wizards. Another shooting guard that I like is DeMar DeRozan from the San Antonio Spurs playing the Dallas Mavericks. DeMar DeRozan has averaged 38.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 29, 43, and 43 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 29, and 42 minutes. He's projected at 40 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.7 times value. He's 8,600 FanDuel salary, but he's 600 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. And take a look at this. He scored 47, 40, 51, 34, and 54 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Mavericks. So 4 out of those 5 games, he's getting you 5 times value or more. I love this DraftKings play. I think he's underpriced on DraftKings. So I like DeMar DeRozan here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, now if you're looking for a value play on FanDuel, take a look at Desmond Bane from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards. Desmond Bane has averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 23 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate. He scored 14, 17, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 18, 21, and 27 minutes. He's projected at 16.3 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.7 times value. He's $3,500 FanDuel salary, but he's $500 more on DraftKings. So this is more of a FanDuel play for me. It's already a high risk, high reward play. So if I'm going to play him, I'm going to play him at low salary on FanDuel. We see that he's got that 30 plus fantasy point upside. So he would smash value here at $3,500 FanDuel salary. If he can score 20, 25, 30 fantasy points, he's going to be a great play on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 238 points scored in this game. It's a high-scoring game and a great matchup. So I like Desmond Bane on FanDuel here versus the Washington Wizards. Okay, now the other shooting guard that I like, kind of an obvious play, but I just want you to note his price on DraftKings. So I like Bradley Beal from the Washington Wizards playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing shooting guards. Bradley Beal has averaged 48.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 36% usage rate. He scored 54, 35, and 61 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 35, and 39 minutes. He's projected at 48.6 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.6 times value because he's $10,500 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,100 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. So he scored 35, 43, 53, 62, and 42 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Grizzlies. So I like Bradley Beal, especially on DraftKings, here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Luka Doncic from the Dallas Mavericks playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Luka Doncic has averaged 53.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 35 minutes per game with a 36% usage rate. He scored 55 and 50 fantasy points in his last 2 games, playing 37 and 33 minutes. He's projected at 52.5 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's $11,000 FanDuel salary, and he's $300 less on DraftKings. Now, we know Luka Doncic has 70 fantasy point upside. He scored 61, 59, 55, 48, and 68 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Spurs. It's a good matchup. That's good player versus team history. So I like Luka Doncic here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Okay, now this was a value play I gave you in my other video. I like Dorian Finney-Smith from the Dallas Mavericks playing the San Antonio Spurs. Dorian Finney-Smith has averaged 20 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with an 11% usage rate. He scored 17, 16, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 34, and 34 minutes. He's projected at 20.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.6 times value. He's $4,600 FanDuel salary and $100 less on DraftKings. So this is somewhat of a high risk, high reward play here. What I like about this pick is that he's playing 34 minutes a game, but you're going to get somewhere between 15, and 35 fantasy points, so there's a wide range of outcomes. I'm guessing his ownership will be somewhat low, and I think he can hit value here tonight. So I like Dorian Finney-Smith here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Another small forward that I like is Josh Richardson from the Dallas Mavericks playing the San Antonio Spurs. Josh Richardson has averaged 22.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 35, 25, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 29, and 25 minutes. He's projected at 22.2 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.1 times value because he's $5,400 FanDuel salary, but he's $500 less on DraftKings. So you're going to need about 24 fantasy points to hit 5 times value on DraftKings. So I think he makes a pretty good DraftKings play. Just keep in mind that Luka Doncic didn't play last game, so it kind of inflated the stats of all these other Dallas Mavericks players. Just keep that in mind when you're looking at the last 3 games fantasy point log for these Dallas Mavericks. But I do like Josh Richardson on DraftKings here versus the San Antonio Spurs.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
The other small forward that I like, especially on DraftKings, is Justice Winslow from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Justice Winslow has averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 22 minutes per game with a 25% usage rate. He scored 23, 17, and 30 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 23, 20, and 20 minutes. He's projected at 19.2 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4 times value because he's $4,800 FanDuel salary, but he's $900 less on DraftKings. So we're not playing Justice Winslow on FanDuel, but I think he makes a really nice DraftKings value play here because we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 238 points scored in this game. It's a great matchup. So I like Justice Winslow as a high-risk, high-reward play on DraftKings here versus the Washington Wizards. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. I like Kristaps Porzingis from the Dallas Mavericks playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the 11th worst defense overall and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing power forwards. Kristaps Porzingis has averaged 36.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He scored 34, 39, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 32, and 25 minutes. He's projected at 37.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.5 times value. He's $8,300 FanDuel salary and $300 more on DraftKings. So we know Porzingis, he has 50 plus fantasy point upside, and he scored 41, 32, 57, 31, and 30 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Spurs. You know, he hasn't hit his ceiling in a while, but I think this might be the game where he can get you 40 to 50 fantasy points and get you close to 5 times value or more. So I like Kristaps Porzingis here versus the San Antonio Spurs. The other power forward that I like is Brandon Clark
from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards, who have the third worst defense overall. And although they've been pretty good versus opposing power forwards, Brandon Clark has averaged 26.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 22, 34, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 29, 34, and 20 minutes. He's projected at 25.3 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.1 times value because he's $6,200 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,000 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. So we're not playing Brandon Clark on FanDuel, but I think he can get you 5 times value or more here on DraftKings. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 237.5 points scored in this game. Looks like the line just changed by half a point there, guys. And he scored 34, 14, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games versus the Wizards. So I like Brandon Clark on DraftKings here versus the Washington Wizards. Okay, now here's a high risk, high reward tournament play on DraftKings only. I like Xavier Tillman from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards, who have the third worst defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Xavier Tillman has averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 20 minutes per game with a 15% usage rate. He scored 14, 14, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 13, 16, and 19 minutes. He's projected at 17.4 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.1 times value because he's $4,300 FanDuel salary, but he's $800 less on DraftKings. So he's only $3,500 DraftKings salary. If he gets 17.4 fantasy points on DraftKings, that's going to give you 5 times value or more. So I like Xavier Tillman on DraftKings as a high-risk, high-reward tournament play here versus the Washington Wizards. And one more high-risk, high-reward tournament play on DraftKings for you. I like Trey Lyles from the San Antonio Spurs playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Trey Lyles has averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 16 minutes per game with a 13% usage rate. But take a look at his last 3 games. He scored 32, 33, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 26, 30, and 27 minutes. So his minutes and his production are way up. He's projected at 17.4 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 3.7 times value. He's $4,700 FanDuel salary, but he's $600 less on DraftKings. So we're not playing Trey Lyles on FanDuel, but I think he's worth a shot over there on DraftKings, especially because he's playing more minutes and he's scored over 30 fantasy points the last 2 games. So he would crush value if he can score you 30 fantasy points or more on DraftKings. So I like Trey Lyles as a high-risk, high-reward play on DraftKings here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, moving on to the center position. There's really not much at the center position on this slate, so I like Jonas Valanciunas from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Washington Wizards, who have the third worst defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing centers. Jonas Valanciunas has averaged 33.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 30, 33, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 28, and 12 minutes. He's projected at 32.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.6 times value. He's $7,000 FanDuel salary and 100 more on DraftKings. Now he scored 33, 36, 23, and 37 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Wizards. It's a great matchup here. Now, just because of the lack of centers on this slate here, I think Jonas Valanciunas probably will be the highest scoring center on the slate by a pretty big margin here. So I like Jonas Valanciunas here versus the Washington Wizards. But now, if you're looking for a value play, especially on DraftKings, take a look at Robin Lopez from the Washington Wizards playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing centers. Robin Lopez has averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 20 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 24, 17, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 26, 13, and 27 minutes. He's projected at 17.2 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.1 times value because he's $4,200 FanDuel salary, but he's $800 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. So I think I'm going to go with Robin Lopez on DraftKings. He's low salary, and he's been playing really well the past few games. He got 26 minutes last game, scored 24 fantasy points. He would crush value on DraftKings if he can get 20 fantasy points or more. And I don't like the other centers on the slate. So I like Robin Lopez, especially on DraftKings here versus the Memphis Grizzlies.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.